Today we are pleased to welcome to the studio Barry Vitou, a partner at the Pinsent Masons law firm based out of London. Barry is the head of the Pinsent Global Financial Crime Team. Barry, welcome to New York.
Richard, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. So Barry, we have been hearing about how Theresa May has called for the SFO to be broken up and dispersed among UK criminal authorities. A recent post on the FCPA blog called it demerged out of existence. So Barry, what's the deal here? Is the SFO here to stay? Now, David Green, in a recent interview, said he's pretty relaxed about it. But what about you?
I'm pretty relaxed about it as well. Theresa May has certainly spoken and been reported as being keen to merge the SFO into the NCA. That preceded her time as Prime Minister. I'm rather hoping that she's got bigger fish to fry these days.
So do you think was there a political underbelly to that, so to speak, in terms of what she said then and what may be the undercurrent now? Or was the impetus for it then more organizational or perhaps economic in nature?
I think there probably was some economics there because of the way that the budgets are allocated. The SFO sits under the Attorney General's budget. She, as former Home Secretary, would have had her own budget, which would have been separate and distinct. So rolling the SFO into the NCA would have increased the NCA budget, for example.
Okay.
But I think also there is a desire to join up law enforcement more. I personally think that the SFO doesn't do a bad job for all of the bad press that is written about it. There is an element of if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Right.
And I would be concerned, were it to be merged into the NCA, that it's the focus on high-end financial crime might be lost because the NCA has such a broad remit.
So what's the differential, or is it a dotted line or a solid line that separates the NCA and the SFO?
Well, I think there's a bright line which separates the two in that, as I said, that they sit under different departments. The SFO is a particular creature of statute set up for a very specific purpose to investigate financial crime. The NCA has a much broader remit, sits under a different department. It ranges from investigating sort of drug trafficking, that sort of stuff, right through to all manner of different crimes. Okay. So it doesn't have the laser-like focus that the SFO has, that is only there to investigate serious financial crime.
So does the SFO have dedicated investigators, for example, or is that part of the NCA where they get those resources?
No, the SFO is a pretty much standalone unit.
Okay.
They have their own. They'll have their own investigators. They could come from a law enforcement background, so there are former police officers there. Okay. They have lawyers inside there as well, and they would also have accountants as well. Whereas the NCA, on the other hand, is basically staffed by law enforcement. So it doesn't have that broad experience that you get in the SFO, largely because it doesn't need it, because it's not investigating that sort of crime.
Well, what about some of the mixed success of convictions in the courtroom with the SFO? I mean, we recently had Tom Hayes sentenced to 11 years over LIBOR manipulation, but 6 of his co-conspirators were acquitted. I mean, that's not something you often see in the courtroom, and is that sort of calling for some legislative relook at the mandate of the SFO?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you could point to successes. The SFO has had a number of successes as well over the past 12 months, a couple of DPAs, first conviction under Section 7. We've been involved in some of those cases. The Tom Hayes LIBOR conviction was a significant result. I mean, I suppose you would, if you go to trial, you go and sort of spin the wheel of fortune before a jury, you will win some and you will lose some. I think if you were to compare the sort of success of those prosecutions, let's say with the Department of Justice, for example, I don't think it would look that out of sync. I think the difficulty that the SFO has always had is that it's a good news story.
We hear about the failures more than the success.
Yeah, I mean, it has created a brand. It has an international brand. Newspapers like to write stories that sell newspapers, and those tend not to be good news stories.
Right.
The last time I checked, anyway. So, but I think to my mind, they've had a pretty good run for the last 12 months or so. Okay. If you look at what they've got on the stocks in terms of investigations, there are significant investigations. If you were to compare, say, the idea that a decade ago they would have been investigating a dozen or 10 companies that we've all heard of, household names. The idea that Rolls-Royce, for example, is under investigation, the idea that GSK is under investigation, the idea that Tesco's has been under investigation. All of these companies are big names in the UK. Sure. So I think they have shifted, and these things are not straightforward to investigate and prosecute. They do take time. And so, yeah, I mean, I think they're doing a pretty good job.
So do you see this, again, in the sort of political context and the public perception context? Is this something that's going to constantly get revisited, or do you sort of see it smoothing out a little bit in terms of, this discussion?
Well, whether it gets constantly revisited probably isn't in their gift. I wish it would settle, because I think it is damaging to the sort of investigation and enforcement of these sorts of cases when the investigatory body that is charged with the task of doing that work is thrown into a position where it has to deal with these sorts of questions, where if putting it into a private context, if you're working for a company of 1,000 people, it doesn't have 1,000 people, but if you were, and every 6 months a takeover rumour emerged in relation to that business, that would be hugely unsettling for the workforce. And that would be something which would be sort of analogous to the SFO's position. So it seems to me that it does no good whatsoever to have this sort of speculation. Is at the end of the day a distraction that need not exist. And I think, I mean, the big question in my mind in all of this is a lot of is spoken about whether the SFO will be rolled into the NCA, but little is said about the work that the NCA is doing, namely the proposed or the suggested new home for the SFO. And so if you are looking at something which basically is working, I think you need to look at what the alternative might be and ask yourself, is that working at an optimum level at the moment? And that, I think, would be an interesting debate.
Well, and I think you're right. It can't help in terms of attracting and keeping, high quality prosecutors and investigators, particularly with people, with accounting backgrounds that could go to work in the commercial workplace as well.
Yeah, well, you have that. I think it's fair to say that the private sector, as is the case here, pays far more than the public sector. So, but I think there is an element, or it is a distraction for those that work there if they think that this time next year they may be sort of split hither and yon. What does that do for morale? So the morale, I think, there is pretty good in context, but it is a distraction.
Fair enough. So let's change subjects for a moment to another unique difference between our two nations divided by a common language. It's called Blockbusster Funding. So I was recently reading an article about how the SFO was seeking funds which were ultimately granted for the ERNC bribery probe. So Barry, how does that work? Does the SFO get its funding per investigation?
It has a sort of basic funding level. I forget the exact number, but I think it's around £40 million, which is sort of chicken feed in the grand scheme of things, I guess.
Right.
That, to my mind, keeps the lights on and enables them to do sort of, your run-of-the-mill case. When they have a very large case that they're investigating, that simply isn't enough. Blockbuster funding is a means by which they can approach the Treasury and ask for more funding for that particular investigation, which they have done in relation to a number of different investigations over time. David Green, I think, says that he's never been refused, and that therefore that the Treasury is happy to provide that blockbuster funding, and that David's view is that the funding of the SFO is adequate.
Right.
He and I, who may agree about some things, but we don't agree about that particular thing, I think that the £40 million is not enough to keep them to do what they need to do. I think being forced to go to government to ask for blockbuster funding on cases that should be adequately funded in any event, again, is an unnecessary sort of bureaucratic hurdle that they face.
Does such Treasury funding require parliamentary approval?
No, I don't think it does, but it certainly gets discussed and is disclosed from it's the Parliament. So it will appear at sort of select committees and things like that. But I think it's just because the number is so low. It would be one thing because, say for example, because the basic funding budget is low, it doesn't take much for them to require blockbuster funding.
Sure.
So I think you could make a good case for increasing their budget, which at the end of the day, in a government context, is insignificant, by a small amount, which would remove the need for them to, I suppose, continually go cap in hand for blockbuster funding and to do it on an exceptional only basis.
So I guess the scary part of this question is, what would happen if the Treasury said no?
Well, David Green's answer to that question is that he would make a song and dance about that in the media, and that would not be something which the government of the day would want. You can imagine a scenario where he might disclose the fact that he'd requested blockbuster funding for an investigation, and that the media might suggest that it hadn't been granted because there perhaps was a conflict of interest. So I don't think he foresees that it would not be granted, which to my mind simply makes my point again, which is this is a nonsense. Give them a reasonable budget for the sort of investigations that they do, given that they are doing serious investigations which require a degree of funding which perhaps is not required for some of the more straightforward prosaic cases. And then if they need on an exceptional basis to go back, then let them do that. But at the moment, it's more of a, you can anticipate that year on year they will be going to the Treasury for blockbuster funding, which makes no sense to me.
And I would imagine there's enough fiscal experience now with the SFO that you could look back at what's been spent in prior years and to come up with a reasonable forecast of what the next year might have.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Of course, the difficulty is that all governments are cash-strapped, shall we say, and have been looking to make budget cuts. And they have certainly, they're no different to any other government department. That is what the SFO is, after all.
And the other question is, can you really ring-fence funds? I mean, is that something that's audited? I mean,
yeah, they are audited. They have their own set of annual accounts. It's published. You can see what they spend and to a degree where they spend it.
So there is a little bit of accountability that when the Treasury grants those funds, that they need to be used for those investigations.
There's a lot of accountability, which is why you read about it in the papers all the time.
So it wouldn't be an interview without talking about Brexit. I read in a recent article that you said you don't have it, seeing it as having any impact. I'm happy to hear anything else you might want to add about that, as long as, and I mean this apolitically, you don't ask me about our election.
I'm not going to ask you about your election. I have said that I don't think that Brexit will make a big difference in an enforcement context, by which I mean it would appear to me to be, well, crass stupidity if law enforcement agencies off the back of Brexit cease to cooperate with each other. And the backdrop actually is, I think that probably the UK enforcement agencies have got more to give than perhaps some of their counterparts elsewhere.
Sure.
So it would really be a foolish thing to do, and for that reason I don't think it will happen. I do think that Brexit will have an impact, an indirect impact, when it comes to the enforcement of, or when it comes to anti-bribery and bribery risk. And the reason I say that is because as a result of Brexit, UK businesses are being encouraged by government in a way that they have not previously been encouraged to go beyond the Eurozone and to some degree their comfort zone to export to emerging markets, most of which, and all of the viewers of the FCPA blog are familiar with the TI map. They want them, the UK government is telling everybody to get into the red bit of that map and start exporting. Now, it seems to me there is an obvious risk which goes along with that. For companies that have been used to trading in safe bits of the Eurozone, where this risk is perhaps relatively speaking quite low, to do nothing more than they have already done and to start going to places that are a very deep scarlet on the map, assuming everything to be the same, I think places them in some significant risk. We are helping some of our clients that are preparing for that risk and sort of upping the systems and controls and training people and that sort of thing. But there'll be plenty out there that don't. And I think that, I hope that they don't fall into some of the traps that are out there for the unwary.
How does the UK promote that? In other words, in the US, we have the US Department of Commerce that has trade missions and, in a general sense, tries to promote and help companies to export. What's the mechanism for that in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think the US, frankly, is probably better set up for it. The truth is that there are trade missions around specific topics. They may come to the US as they may go to India, for example, and other places. The Foreign Office, which is also an underfunded government department, used to have trade missions inside them. To a large degree, that's been cut. I think the reality is there's very little support. You do have another government department, BIS, in the UK, which will assist. But again, the assistance is quite limited. I mean, companies are basically being encouraged. It used to be get on your bikes. Today it's get on planes to go off and do these things. And when they get there, although they may go and book a meeting with somebody at the consulate or the embassy, there is little help that they can give, and they're largely being asked to get on with it.
So these frontier markets, as they've been called, are they're lucrative, but commercial opportunity and corruption risk are pretty intertwined in some of these places.
Well, there is a risk-reward corollary, isn't there? Yeah. And I think that's the concern.
Well, Barry, thank you for your time today and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.